Welcome to Trails Worth Hiking, the show that brings you some of the most interesting backpacking and trekking routes in the world. I'm your host, Jeremy Pendry. In the first part of the show, we bring you the story and history of a trail. Then we tell you what it's like to hike the trail and how you can do it. On this episode, we go on a pilgrimage. I probably don't need to say anything else, and you know the trail we're talking about. Yes, that pilgrimage. We'll start our pilgrimage in the French Pyrenees and hike hundreds of miles across northern Spain to Santiago de Compostela in Galicia, where the remains of St. James, one of the 12 apostles of Jesus, may lie. And we'll even take a bonus walk through Portugal to the same destination. Because as we'll see, there are many caminos leading to this destination. On this episode of Trails Worth Hiking, we travel the Camino de Santiago in northern Spain. Hello and welcome to the show, everyone. Reach out to me at trailsworthhiking@gmail.com with ideas for future episodes. And please follow us on Instagram at Trails Worth Hiking Podcast. Welcome to 2024. Happy New Year. And thanks again for continuing to listen to the show. I really appreciate it. Let's talk about a few stats on 2023. The listenership of the show is in the top 5% of podcasts on a downloads per episode basis of the shows that use the same hosting service that I use, so shows that use Buzzsprout. So I don't know how that fits in with other podcast hosting services and their numbers of downloads, but it sounds pretty good to me. It feels great to be in the top 5% of shows on Buzzsprout, and I really appreciate all of your support, and just wanted to let you know that without you, there would be no success for the show. Also, in 2023, we had listeners tune in from more than 100 different countries. I can definitely say when I started this podcast in the summer of 2020, in the early days of the pandemic, I definitely didn't expect it would reach listeners in so many parts of the world. So I'm also grateful that we have people tuning in from so many different places. Seattle, Washington is the city with the highest number of listeners in 2023. So thank you so much to all the folks in Seattle who listen to the show. I also started the Instagram account for the show in 2023, and that's been fun for me to be able to share my pictures and your pictures of hikes that we've covered on the show. So if you haven't followed us on Instagram, please do that right now. I'll wait. Okay, thank you. We have a lot of great plans for 2024. We have several episodes in production, and that means several episodes that I've recorded but have not gotten around to editing. And we also have plans for many more great episodes. And we're starting out the year with the Camino de Santiago, so we're keeping it going with some great content. Thanks again for a great 2023. We also have some exciting plans to continue to work with our sponsor, Outdoor Herbivore. There may be some changes coming there. We're changing up the discount program a bit. And I think we'll probably be offering another Trails Worth Hiking meal pack for a limited time, like we did last year. So make sure to listen to upcoming episodes to hear when that drops. And there may be some additional exciting things coming with Outdoor Herbivore. So with that, let me remind you about Outdoor Herbivore. Outdoor Herbivore makes delicious backpacking meals with quality ingredients. The meals are vegetarian or vegan, but as I always say, you don't need to be vegetarian or vegan to enjoy these meals. They have lots of calories for a hungry hiker. They're packaged to make them easy to boil in a bag. So all you need to do is add hot water and let them sit for about 10 minutes. There's a variety of great options. And I've talked about some of my favorites in the past, such as the chickpea sesame ziti, or the blackened quinoa, or the naked freckled burrito, to name a few. So to get a 10% discount off your order on Outdoor Herbivore, enter TWH10P, TWH10P, so that's Trails Worth Hiking 10%, to get a discount on your order at outdoorherbivore.com. Outdoor Herbivore ships worldwide, so you don't have to be in the United States to order from them. They also sell bulk ingredients if you happen to want to make your own meals just from base ingredients. So go to Outdoor Herbivore right now and start ordering food for the upcoming spring backpacking season. Outdoor Herbivore at outdoorherbivore.com. All right. Our guest on this episode is author Suzanne Roberts. Suzanne is a travel writer, memoirist, and poet. She has a focus mostly on the outdoors in her work, though on some other issues as well. She recently published an updated edition of Almost Somewhere, 28 Days on the John Muir Trail. That was originally published in 2012, but her updated edition is in 2023. You can check her out at suzanneroberts.net. She has hiked the John Muir Trail several times, so we talk some about that during our conversation. But recently, she and her husband hiked the Camino de Santiago. In addition to hiking the route that most of us know, the Camino Francés, she hiked part of the Camino Portugués and also the Dos Faros route, and she talks with me about that as well. So today, the Camino is certainly one of the most well-known treks or series of routes in the world. But as we'll see, it wasn't always so. The Camino is a pilgrimage route and not just a hike, so it can have very different meanings to different people. Let me be upfront so that you understand the perspectives you will hear on this episode. Neither Suzanne nor I are Catholic. Thus, our understanding of what the Camino means as a pilgrimage is an intellectual understanding and not a spiritual understanding. We both come at this as outsiders to the faith. As you will hear, when Suzanne hiked the trail, she came to realize that the fact that it is a pilgrimage is important, even if it was not an important fact to her from a spiritual perspective. So please give us some latitude for both our ignorance and lack of a complete understanding of the sacred connection to the walk. As I've said in past episodes, we all bring a different perspective and experience to a hike, and that is especially so with a route that for many is a religious pilgrimage. So even if you are Catholic and have a deeper religious connection to the Camino, I hope this episode can broaden your perspective and allow you to see how it might seem from outside that religious experience. So with that caveat, let's talk about the Camino. Saint James is one of the original apostles of Jesus. He was also a cousin of Jesus and the brother of John the Apostle. A little side note here on the name James. So in Spanish, there are lots of translations for the name James. There's Diego, there's Jaime, there's also Tiago. And in this case, the name Santiago really just means Saint James. In English, the Camino de Santiago is often referred to as the Way of Saint James. All right, back to our story. Legend has it that the apostles divided the known world into missionary zones, and James got the Iberian Peninsula. In modern parlance, he would have been sort of Christianity's head of regional sales for Spain. James may have spent several years preaching in Spain before returning to Jerusalem, where in the year 44 of the Common Era, so 44 AD, he was beheaded at the orders of King Herod, thereby becoming the first apostle to be martyred. It's not clear how he pissed off the king, but in some way he did and was killed for it. A story arose that his followers carried his body to a stone boat and that they were guided by angels and carried by the wind through the Pillars of Hercules, which we today call the Strait of Gibraltar, and that the boat landed at Padrón in northern Spain near Finisterre. The site of Finisterre raises something interesting about possible pre-Christian pagan roots of the Camino. Cape Finisterre was once viewed as literally the end of the world. In fact, that is what the word means. There may have been a route that followed the Milky Way to Fisterra, which is today's Finisterre. So in other words, if you followed the path of the Milky Way to the edge of Spain, you ended up at that location. There's a legend that when the sun went beneath the waves, the veil between this world and the next thinned, opening the gates to the afterlife. To counteract ill will from this, pagans made offerings to appease the gods at Finisterre. This is all just to say that it is interesting that this is near where legend has it that the body of St. James returned to Spain. When the body arrived, a local queen had it brought to a marble tomb, and he was buried there with two of his disciples and forgotten for centuries. Then let's fast forward to 814 AD, where Pelagius, a Galician hermit, had a vision in which he saw a star, or possibly a field of stars. The stars led him to an ancient tomb containing three bodies. Again, we have what may be a crossover between the pagan Milky Way story and the Christian story. Pelagius reported it to the local bishop. The bishop checked it out and decided it was St. James and his two disciples that he had discovered. How or why he concluded this versus all other possibilities of who these three bodies were, we don't know. So, as is the case with a lot of things in religion, a measure of faith is probably helpful to stick with the story. The bishop reported it to the king of Asturias, who then declared St. James the patron saint of Spain, or what would later be Spain. A small village and a monastery were established on the site, and the village was named Field of Stars, or Campo de la Stella, or Compostela. Again, a mix of the Milky Way and Christianity as part of the story, although there's another theory that Compostela comes from the Roman word for cemetery, so who knows. Soon after, pilgrims began arriving to the site, and miracles soon became attributed to the site. This was something the Archbishop of Galicia encouraged, and some religious orders of France also supported the pilgrimage, and that was where a lot of the pilgrims were coming from. The bigger context to the story is important here. The Muslim conquest of Spain by the Moors started in 711 AD. The Moors ended up kicking out the Visigoths, which were earlier Germanic conquerors of the Iberian Peninsula. Thus, the Spanish and the Christian French to the north had a strong interest in establishing holy credentials for the area and getting Christians to come, and they hoped to stay and settle in what is now northern Spain. The Moors did eventually destroy the church that was built there, but in 899 a new, larger one was built, and then in 1078 construction began on a Romanesque cathedral in the city. It should be said here, as I think I mentioned in the intro, there are many caminos. People left from wherever they lived, so there are many routes that developed to get to Santiago de Compostela. There's the Camino del Norte and Camino Primitivo, and those were likely the earliest, safest routes. The del Norte route is along the northern Atlantic coast of Spain that goes through San Sebastian and Bilbao and Santander and that area. The Primitivo begins in Oviedo, which at the time was the capital of the Kingdom of Asturias. King Alfonso II, also known as Alfonso the Chaste, took this route in the 9th century. That may have been the original Camino. And there are many other Caminos, but when people talk about the Camino de Santiago, they mean the Camino Frances. In other words, the Camino that starts in France. The Camino Frances was developed by King Sancho the Great and Alfonso VI after pushing the Moors back from the area. The pilgrimage on the Camino de Santiago reached its peak in the Middle Ages. By the 12th century, it was a very organized type of endeavor and very popular, and a massive infrastructure had been built up around the pilgrimage. There were towns, there were churches, monasteries, there were bridges across rivers to make the route easier to walk. There were businesses, even hospitals. And Christian kings offered certain privileges to those who settled along the route, so there were incentives to do so. At the time, as many as 250,000 people a year walked the Camino. I saw some estimates that were even as high as 500,000 a year by the 13th century. In 1140, Aymeric Picot wrote the Codex Calixtinus, which is widely regarded as the world's first travel guidebook. The Codex was a guide to walking the pilgrimage route of the Camino de Santiago. So this was really a high point for the Camino, where it had hundreds of thousands of people a year. a business and religious infrastructure, as well as an actual physical infrastructure of roads and bridges, and even a guidebook, as we've discussed. But by the 16th century, the Camino had gone into decline. Spain had entered wars with France and England, which cut off the route to many of its pilgrims. And Martin Luther's Protestant Reformation had begun, which looked down on these kind of ritual indulgences. And then later along came the Enlightenment, which probably didn't help. The cathedral was revamped in the 18th century, but that didn't draw back pilgrims. All that said, it never completely died out. And as we all know, there has been a modern resurgence. Father Elias Valinia, a Galician priest, worked to repopularize the route starting in the 1980s. He developed the modern scallop symbol, the sort of clamshell symbol of the route, which was modeled on the seashells the pilgrims of the past had worn to show that they had made it to the sea. In 1985, 1,245 pilgrims traveled the route. By 1993, there were 100,000. By 2010, there were 270,000. And in 2018, there were 327,000. So its popularity has grown exponentially in recent years. Movies like Martin Sheen's The Way and some books written about the Camino, as well as the easy availability of information about the hike on the internet, has no doubt helped increase the awareness of it and the people setting out to hike the trail. So with that history of the Camino de Santiago, let's jump into my conversation with Suzanne Roberts. Suzanne Roberts, welcome to the show. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
So you are a writer. Can you talk a bit about the kind of writing that you do?
Yeah, it's interesting because I think so often writers pigeonhole themselves as I am a novelist or I'm a poet or I'm a travel writer. And I think of myself as a storyteller. So I've published in poetry, I've published in nonfiction, travel writing, memoir. I'm working on a novel. So I am the kind of writer who just likes to explore.
But a lot of your writing does have a focus on the outdoors, right?
It does. It does. And, we can't help but write our obsessions. And so my various obsessions are the outdoors, the wilderness, skiing, travel. And then the last few years, I've been writing a lot about loss and grief because I'm at that age where I lost my parents and I'm starting to lose friends. And so I think I just write into my obsessions. And the outdoors is one of my obsessions.
And so I think maybe your first book, though, was one about a hike, right?
Well, I published 4 books of poetry before I published Almost Somewhere. Yeah. But my first prose book was about a hike that I took in 1993. Right after college, 2 girlfriends and I decided to hike the John Muir Trail. And I was very inexperienced. And we set off and I was 22 years old. And I kept a journal the entire time with no idea that I'd write a book about it. But of course, I did end up publishing a book about it about 17 years after the hike took place.
And so this was Almost Somewhere, 28 Days on the John Muir Trail. And there's actually a new edition of the book out. Can you tell me a little bit about the new edition? Is there something updated or different or interesting about that edition?
Yeah. So last summer, my husband and I hiked the John Muir Trail. He had never hiked it. And so I was consulting my own book every day to sort of see what was next and to see how my point of view changed, how the landscape has changed, how the trail has changed, because it's all changed. And as I was reading it, there were so many things that were sort of cringy, things that were sayable back when I wrote the book that are less sayable. And I'll give you an example. So I was very afraid of men on the trail. Like I had that stranger danger. And so I would often refer to men who had there was a guy who had returned from the Gulf War and he had PTSD, and I would call him like crazy and, insane. And obviously now I would handle that material with a lot more sensitivity. So although I didn't change everything because I wanted the book to be true to the story it was, I toned down a few things. And then I talked about what I toned down in the afterword. So I wrote an afterword about how I've changed in the last 30 years. It's been 30 years exactly since that first hike took place, how the trail has changed and how backpacking has changed. And also when I went, I had read all these male, dead white men nature writers, as we did, right, back in the 90s, Muir and Thoreau and Emerson and Odabe. And I thought, wow, how come I'm not seeing nature in this sort of male way of conquer and out alone in the wilderness and not being afraid? And I wrote into that, trying to find a uniquely sort of feminine view of the wilderness. But then what I've realized since is that those writers were also writing from a very colonial, imperialistic perspective, which is why it was all about conquer. And there was a lot of erasure going on. John Muir talks about this sort of Garden of Eden of the Sierra. And, I still respect his writing, but I also know that a lot of erasure of Native people is taking place in that writing. So I learned a lot. And so I added an afterword and a land acknowledgement and 29 photos from the original trip, which readers asked for, and book club discussion questions. So there's a lot more sort of fun stuff in the new edition.
So I have to ask you, you hiked the trail that first time from south to north, which is a pretty tough way to do it. Did you do that again when you did it the second time, or did you go this time from Yosemite Valley south?
Well, this last time we went Yosemite south.
Okay.
But I've hiked the John Muir Trail now 4 times, and I've done it twice in both directions.
Okay.
I don't know. I mean, I think the hardest thing about hiking from Whitney to Yosemite in a big snow year is that you're going down all those north faces with snow. And I think it's harder to go down snowy fields than up. And I think that's the hardest part. And too, that hike, up to Whitney. But, in my book, Almost Somewhere, I talk about how it takes us like 4 days to do like what people do in one day. So we were pretty slow.
So I'm curious how you got into backpacking and these kinds of outdoor activities in the first place.
When I grew up in Sherman Oaks, in an apartment building, my parents didn't have a lot of money. We didn't take family vacations. Neither of them had ever been to college. My mother didn't even graduate from high school. So I grew up with not a lot of resources or vacations and things like that. But I really always loved like playing in the dirt and, collecting bugs and all the nature things. And so when I decided very young that when I was a grown up, I was going to go out into nature more and that I was going to become a ski instructor, which I ended up doing for a while. And so when I went to college, I joined the outdoor club. And so I learned how to do all, the outdoor things. I learned how to backpack and how to rock climb and how to go. I went spelunking. I mean, I did everything you could possibly sign up for. And I really took to backpacking. And I was super inexperienced when I went on that first trip when I was 22. But since then, I've become a lot more experienced because I really do love wilderness backpacking. So I sort of was a self-study,
Yeah. Well, it's great that once you found the interest, you pursued it as much as you could.
Yeah.
So let's fast forward quite a few years now, up to very recently. How did you decide to hike the Camino de Santiago?
It's really interesting. I feel like I am, if I were to write a book about the Camino, it would be called The Reluctant Pilgrim. So I have a really different story, I think, about the Camino de Santiago than most people. And I'll try to explain it as we go. But the first time I saw people hiking the Camino, it was back in 2002. I was living in Spain. I was teaching a class on Spanish poets and Spanish film and wine of Spain. And I went to Santiago de Compostela, which back then was a quiet, beautiful, there was nobody there. It wasn't full of tourists the way it is now. And I fell in love with the city. And I saw a handful over the weekend of pilgrims coming in. And I thought, what are they doing? They look terrible, right? Ragged. And I thought, what are they doing? And they'd crawl up to the, cathedral. And I thought, what the heck? And I learned that they were pilgrims. And of course, right, there was probably a pilgrimage before the Catholic pilgrimage, right, which started like around 900. But the Catholic pilgrimage became very, very popular and then became sort of died out with the plague. And it was one of the ways that the plague spread across Northern Europe, which, with a big joke, this time everyone had COVID. I got COVID for the first time. And they all were all calling it the Camino cough. And the joke was like, okay, this is the second plague spreading across, right, northern Spain. And so anyway, so I did some research and I thought, oh, that would be cool, And the boyfriend I was with at the time was Jewish and I'm Jewish. And he's like, you can't do that. That's a Catholic pilgrimage. And I was like, it doesn't matter. I like to walk and I like Spain. So that was always in my mind. Like, it doesn't matter. I don't have to do it as a pilgrimage. But I came to learn that it very much is a Catholic pilgrimage, even though only about 20% of the people self-report that they're doing it as a Catholic pilgrimage. That walk goes by every church, every cathedral, every monastery, even the graffiti is Jesus this and Jesus is that and God loves you. And so it was really an interesting walk for me because I felt really uncomfortable and I couldn't put my finger on it exactly. Since I have figured it out. And I ended up reading, while I was on the Camino, I actually listened to it, a book called Stealing My Religion by Liz Buchar. And it's about religious appropriation. And she talks about the Camino. And I thought, that's it. I feel really uncomfortable because I feel like I'm appropriating someone else's Camino. And even though, right, plenty of people do it as this sort of, self-growth or transformative experience, it made me a little bit uncomfortable.
So what did you do then to decide what you were going to do? And partly I'm asking this because you actually hiked the Camino Francés and the Camino Portugués, which are different Caminos. Most people, I think, are familiar with the Camino Francés. And when they think of the Camino de Santiago, they think of the Camino Francés, right?
Right. I mean, there are about 8 Caminos that end in Santiago de Compostela. And the one that comes up Portugal also ends there. And so we ended up hiking the Francés. And at the beginning, I was gonna give up, not because it was hard, but because I felt like I wasn't really in Spain. You know what I mean? Like I felt like, okay, there are all these people from all over the world, and we're all having this sort of experience, and we're all going to these cafes, but like we're not really in Spain. It was a very, very strange feeling for me. So I told my husband, I said, I'm just going to, go rent a place and write on the coast, to do a writing retreat. But then I ended up hiking through COVID and hiking through, knee problems and shin splints and the whole thing. And we ended up hiking to the coast, to Murcia. First Finisterre and then Murcia, which was my favorite part. That was beautiful, from Santiago de Compostela to the coast. And then we rented a little cabin, if you could even call it that, in Galicia on the coast. And there we discovered the Camino dos Faros, which is this really rugged Camino with no infrastructure. It's not a religious Camino. It's a Camino of lighthouses. It's incredible. It's so beautiful. And so we walked part of that. And then we ended up taking a road trip through Portugal. And we decided we wanted to continue to see the landscape through walking. So we didn't do it from Lisbon because we'd already sort of done a road trip around that area. So we went to Porto and we walked from there, and we walked north and we walked on the coastal route. So that felt really good. It felt more natural, more nature with the ocean and less of a religious infrastructure as well.
So you actually had planned to hike the sort of more traditional Camino and then just sort of winged it and ended up hiking part of the Portuguese.
Yes. So we pre-booked every single night on the Camino Francés. Uh-huh. And we had to change some of it because we got COVID, and we ended up staying in apartments and taking a couple of rest days and quarantining, of course. And so we realized that you can wing it depending on what you want. Like if you want a $5 bunk bed and you want, then you have to get up super early and do all these other kinds of things. But we were more flexible. And so we booked everything. And then we realized that we really could do it. We could wing it. So we did. We booked, I think we booked a few days in advance. and it was fine. The places were not the best places, but they were fine.
When you say we, was this you and your husband?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
My husband and I.
And so what time of year did you do these hikes?
We started in May. I think we left the country May 7th, and we spent a couple days in Barcelona and then went up to Saint-Jean-Pied-de-Port and walked. Took us about 30 days to get to the coast. And we took a rest day in every city, which I would recommend. So we took a rest day in Pamplona, Logroño, Burgos, all the big cities. And then it took us, we did not go all the way into Santiago de Compostela on the Portuguese route because I didn't like the last 100 kilometers from Sarria into Santiago de Compostela because it was so crowded. And I didn't even bother with a Compostela, when I came in, because I was like, forget it. I'm not going to, all these people will only walk 70 miles and they're going to get one. So I was like,
wait, so you did not get your final stamp at the final place?
I got all my stamps,
okay.
But I did not, and I didn't bother with stamps on the Portuguese. People kept saying, want a stamp? I'm like, no, I don't need one. But I got a book of stamps. I don't even know where it went. And my husband got his Compostela and he doesn't know where it is. So these people who are so set on that Compostela, I just say, you're just going to lose it. You know what I mean? So that was not important to me at all.
How was the weather from May? So it sounds like May, June time period, roughly. How was the weather in that time period? Is this a time of year that you would recommend other people do it? It's a little bit before the high tourist season. Maybe the weather's pretty good already. It seems like a good time.
Yeah, May was great, actually. It got more crowded in June with the school holidays, but the coastal route of the Portuguese, there was nobody on it. I mean, we'd go a whole day sometimes without seeing anybody, which was really different than the Frances. I will say we crossed the Pyrenees in, rain and hail and fog and, I think it snowed 2 days before we crossed. Uh-huh. It's not hard. For someone who's used to hiking, I mean, it's like a 10th of Forester Pass. You know what I mean? It's not hard, but it was really cold and rainy and it rained a lot at the beginning, but that was fine.
I did that route once and it was really easy because I drove it.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
We drove from Saint-Jean-Pied-de-Port to Pamplona.
Oh, okay.
Many years ago. So, and we saw the Camino hikers along the trail along the side of the highway. You could see them, dipping in and out or crossing the road at different places. And it was actually one of the things that piqued my interest in sort of learning more about the Camino was seeing all the hikers out there. And of course, seeing them at the starting town in France. So the Camino Frances is 769 kilometers, so getting close to 500 miles. How many days did this take for you guys to do, roughly?
About 30. And we added the 50 more miles
to the coast.
Kilometers to the coast, yeah.
Okay.
It took about a month. Mm-hmm. And I would say we averaged, and like I said, we took 5 or 6 rest days. We probably averaged 15 miles a day.
And you think that's a pretty reasonable pace for most people to do?
Most people, no. I mean, I think most hikers who are used to hiking and have a reasonable level of fitness, yes. But it was a lot of walking. And when you average 15, it means some days you do 21 or 24 or 20. I think our biggest day was 26.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a really long day. And for me, it wasn't that I wasn't fit enough. It was that my body just started to break down. My knees started to hurt and my hips started to hurt and I got shin splints and a lot of people had blisters. There were more people you wouldn't believe how many people give up just because of blisters. So I think my biggest recommendation would be really figure out your system. Put the hiker goo on your feet every single day, especially if it's going to rain. Figure out what works for you, because even though I did that, I still had blisters, but they were not blisters that would have sent me off the trail.
In addition to making sure you have great footwear and good understanding of how to care for your feet, what kind of gear did you carry for this? Is this basically, are you carrying everything you need? Did you have luggage transferred ahead, or how did you do that?
Yeah. So this is such an interesting topic for the Camino. And if you go on to the Facebook Camino groups, which I don't recommend actually, but if someone's going to do the Camino and you go onto the Camino groups, you are going to think that people on the Camino are mean, okay, and judgmental. And the reason is because of this sort of rootedness in this religious pilgrimage, there are a couple of requirements, right? If you're taking a religious pilgrimage, because way back when, the reason the pilgrimage started with the Catholic Church is because they wanted to repopulate the area with Catholics and take the control away from the Moors. So it was a political reason. And they basically offered a free ticket to heaven, like you could skip purgatory. So in order to do that, you had to do certain things, like you had to suffer, you had to leave your worldly possessions behind, you had to, pray every day, be one with God, all those things. And so the modern Camino has weirdly picked and chosen some of those requirements for no reason at all. It's not like a reason of, skipping purgatory. So there's people on the Camino who really believe that if you don't carry your own backpack, you are not a real pilgrim, right? And also sometimes we ran into people who had really bad feet issues, stuff like that, and would maybe skip a day and take a taxi. Then of course people would get really angry about that too. You're not a real pilgrim or whatever. And so the luggage transfer thing, people feel guilty about it, which I think is ridiculous. I think if you want to transfer your luggage, you should. I mean, if someone was going to transfer my luggage for €5 a day on the John Muir Trail, I'd probably let them,
Yeah.
There's no choice, right? I mean, you could have it carried by a mule, but that's way more expensive than €5 a day. So I didn't bring much, but I did bring a computer because I was working, and a Kindle because I wanted to read. So my backpack was heavier than it probably should have been. And I would say I carried it 50% of the time. The other 50% of the time, or maybe I carried it 60%, something like that. And I would just decide that night, like at the albergue, they'd have like a little envelope. You'd put €5 in, you'd stick it by the door. And then of course, if I did that, my husband would stuff all his heavy stuff in it, and I carried a little bag and he carried his light backpack. And we would choose to do that depending on, how we were feeling. When I had COVID, I definitely transferred my bag because we were still hiking like 15 miles a day and I was pretty sick despite my 6 vaccines or whatever. When I hurt my knee, when I had the shin splint. So there were certain times, or if I knew we were doing 26 miles, because it's like, why should I carry this? You know what I mean? I don't need to suffer. I'm going to suffer enough. And so that luggage transfer thing is a really interesting component of the Camino and the way people view it.
I do think also, I mean, this is just me speculating, but you tell me what you think. I think there's a fair number of people who do the Camino for religious or even quasi-religious reasons. And I know several people who've done the Camino who are Catholic, but not very religious Catholic, but I think they are doing it for somewhat of a religious reason, but they're not maybe thinking of it in those terms, at least consciously or overtly, or talking about it that way. And I think for a lot of these people, they've never hiked anything close to this. They've never hiked anything big. Like they may have hiked, like a lot of people, day hikes, but they've probably not done a lot of backpacking, if any. And so you have a lot of people on the Camino who are not used to this sort of endeavor, and that can create a lot of issues, right? Like you might have the wrong gear, you might be carrying too much when you should be carrying less, you might have terrible shoes. There's all kinds of things that happen when you're inexperienced in multi-day trekking. And this is a big trek. This is 30 days. So I think maybe some of the suffering is sort of that may come from people are not really prepared to undertake what they're about to undertake.
Yeah. I mean, I think you're right, but there is that layer. And the reason I know that there's a layer because it's a religious pilgrimage is because I've done a lot of other kinds of long distance hikes where baggage transfer is normal. It's like what you do.
Yep.
I hiked the coast to coast across England. I hiked the West Highland Way in Scotland, and almost every single person transferred their bag. And that was just like the normal thing you did. Like if you saw someone with a big backpack, you're like, what the hell are they doing? Why are they doing that? And so it's a different mindset.
On the trail, you've got accommodations at these guest houses along the way. Could you describe sort of what that is and how it works on the Camino?
Yeah. So there are these, buildings called albergues, and some of them are supported by the Spanish government, and some of them are supported by Catholic organizations so that they can offer pilgrims very inexpensive accommodations. And so you can stay in the municipal albergue. You can't make a reservation at those, but you can stay at, like a lot of people have hiked the Camino and decided they want to live on the Camino, and they start these albergues. And you can rent a bed in a big dorm room, or you can rent a private room and like share bathrooms. And if you're traveling as like a couple or with two people, it's very minimal, costs more to have a private room. So that's one of the reasons we booked ahead, because we wanted to book there's only like, a few private rooms in each albergue. And so we ended up booking our private rooms so that we would have a space to sleep without a million other people, and share bathrooms and stuff like that. But that's where we got COVID, was an albergue, because of course everything else is communal living, communal. And that's part of the beauty, and the reason people do the Camino is because, unlike wilderness hiking, it's a very social experience, and people talk about their Camino families, and they meet people. And in fact, I just checked WhatsApp right before we started our conversation, and there was a message from someone I met who lives in Mexico who said, "How are you?" that I met on the Camino, and so I've stayed in touch with a number of people I've met. And so you can do it in different ways. You can do it very inexpensively. My husband and I, every time we got to a big city, we rented an apartment. So we'd have a washer and dryer, and we could, wash our clothes and do all that. I mean, we did go to a lot of laundromats, of course, but, and washed in sinks and things like that. But we did a more, not completely would not call our accommodations luxurious, but we definitely didn't do the bare bones sleeping on the bunk beds every night.
So how did you figure out what accommodations to get? Because you said you reserved them all in advance. Were you basically just following what the traditional stages are and getting a room at the end of each? Or did you kind of guess how far you'd go each day? Or how did you decide that?
We got a map and we got a guidebook. We're very old school. We still have paper maps when we go hike in the wilderness. And so we got a map and we got a guidebook, and we looked at it, and we looked at how many miles we might want to hike. And then we looked at the different choices. And luckily we didn't always stay on stage, because there are stages. And when you stay off stage, there's a ton of benefits. One is doesn't fill up. Another one, when you leave in the morning, it's not everyone leaving at once. So you're either ahead or behind people, so you don't see as many people. If you want a little bit of solitude. So we didn't always stay on stage, which was great. And I didn't know how important that would be till I got out there. And then sometimes we had to go directly on the website, and I can speak Spanish. So I would just, send a message in Spanish and say, we'd like a book a room. And mostly they'd say, okay, just let us know the day before that you're coming. Like no credit card or anything, but they held the room for us. And sometimes we could use booking.com, which was actually really convenient, because then it was easier because it was all there and we could see where we were staying each night. So that was a great resource too. And Airbnb for the apartments.
Where do you fly into to get to the start of this?
Well, the way we did it isn't the easiest way, because we were traveling for 3 months, and we wanted to leave a bag in Barcelona at my friend's house. So we flew into Barcelona, took the train to Pamplona, and then took a very exciting bus ride into Pied-de-Port. And I thought it was beautiful, but if you are, one who gets motion sickness, you might want to sit in front of the bus.
That was probably that road that I took over the Pyrenees.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Okay. And as far as I assume it's really easy to get from place to place. There's a million people doing the same hike. There's probably signage everywhere, but I'm just curious, like, what is the easiest way to navigate? Did you even have a map, or did you just follow the crowd?
You just follow the arrows. So there's yellow arrows pointed on everything. So my husband and I had this idea at the beginning that we were going to hike the Frances on the way there and then the Norte on the way back. I was like, why not just hike there and back, right? And what I didn't realize is if you go backward, which some people do, and in fact, the true pilgrims, right? That's what you did. You went from your house, you went all the way, and then you went back to your house. And the seashell thing was you picked up a seashell at the ocean to prove you'd been there. So, there's people hanging with their, shell hanging off the back at the beginning. That's not the way it was traditionally done. But what we didn't realize is when you go backwards, you can't find your way because there's no arrow. Right? You can't see where the arrows are. So it's much harder to go against the grain. So I would say 99% of the people go, they all go toward Santiago de Compostela. And so we quickly realized that wasn't going to work. But we did not look at a map at all. I will confess that I have the worst sense of direction of anyone I know. And there are a couple of times that my husband went ahead and I indeed got lost. And, it's almost impossible to get lost. And I was trucking down this highway thinking I was on the Camino and this car was over. And he says in Spanish, "What are you doing?" And I said, "I'm hiking the Camino." And he said, "No, you're not. The Camino is there." And so I was like in the middle of this like freeway, basically in the rain, hiking the Camino. And so I said to him, "Well, can you drive me to so I hopped in the cab and I was, I thought, well, the Camino, these people say the Camino provides. I guess it did because I was in the wrong place.
So you just made my day by solving one of the big mysteries that I had about the Camino, which is why the seashell was the symbol. I didn't know that. It was because people wanted to prove that they went all the way to the ocean. So that's interesting to hear. Another thing that's sort of traditional about the Camino that I mentioned earlier is the stamp book. Could you talk a little bit about what that is and how that works?
Yeah. So every place you go on the Camino, whether it's a cafe or your albergue or churches, and then of course you give a little donativo, right? So the churches get some funding that way. You get stamped in this big book, and then at the end you show your stamps and you get your Compostela. And if you are only hiking the last 100 kilometers of any of the Caminos, you have to get 2 stamps a day. And I think part of that is it's supported obviously by the Spanish government. You want to support local business. So you'll go in, you'll have a cafe con leche, you'll get a stamp. And I love seeing I honestly don't know where my book is, but I'll find it someday. But I loved sort of looking at where I'd been and the different stamps. And some of the businesses have such creative, beautiful stamps.
Cool. All right. So a lot of people may have not been to northern Spain who are listening to this. And can you talk a little bit about what the terrain is like that you're walking through for 30 days?
Yeah, so I can only speak to the Frances. There is a more rugged way called the Primitivo, which is more mountainous. And also the Norte is on the coast. So that one has a bit more up and down. The Frances is pretty, for many, many, many miles, it's pretty flat. Most people are aware that in Europe, there's a lot more human-built environment that you hike through versus like in California, you'll hike through Yosemite National Park or a wilderness area. And so it's very, very different feeling. You don't ever really feel like you're in a wilderness because you're not. So you're walking through like in the Rioja, you're walking through vineyards, and then you're walking in Castilla y León, you're walking through wheat fields, and then you're walking through cornfields. And then when you get to Galicia, you're walking through a lot of small villages with kitchen gardens and small farms, with cows and chickens and things like that, which is, you do feel a little bit closer to your food. And the food is, of course, in Spain is much better than it is here in the United States. And so is the wine, and it's much less expensive. And so you do feel closer to your what you're eating and the landscape in that way. But it's by no means a wilderness experience. And you can't camp. There's no camping permitted on the Frances. So people who have this idea that, well, I'm just going to camp, that's not a thing. The other thing I noticed a lot of is that because there's so many people from all over the world who maybe don't have the same like leave no trace wilderness ethics as we have learned in the United States, there's a ton of toilet paper everywhere, which is a super bummer. People just like leave it all over. And that was a disappointment.
So are there distinct geographical sections? I mean, for me, thinking about where the Camino is, it starts in the Pyrenees. So you've got a sort of mountainous section at the beginning on the Camino Frances. But then, as you said, it becomes more agricultural, sort of rolling hills, maybe that look like a lot of Spain. And then as you get toward Galicia and the coast, it's a little bit different. It's a more green kind of region from what I understand. So is it really just different kinds of agricultural regions, or does it rolling hills the whole way, or does it change kind of geographically as you go?
Well, it definitely changes. I think the reason you hike the Camino isn't necessarily for the landscape, even though it was really beautiful. We were there when all the poppies were in bloom. It's more for the culture, the art in those cathedrals is just astounding. It's some of the best art in the world. And the medieval villages are amazing. The same buildings, they've been there for hundreds and hundreds of years. So there are different regions, you go through, like I said, the wine region, and then the breadbasket of Spain, and the Meseta, which is that middle part, which is where they grow all the wheat, is very, very hot in the summer. It was not hot for us, and I loved it. I thought it was beautiful, but people find it monotonous because it's many miles through wheat fields. But we had the poppies, and I love sort of being nowhere. So for me, that was really beautiful.
So you mentioned the cultural attractions in a way, or the cultural highlights. What were for you some of the most important cultural things that stood out? Some of the churches or medieval towns that you mentioned. Was there anything that really stood out for you that you just were surprised by or really loved that you didn't know was there or hadn't anticipated?
Gosh, there were so many. I mean, the Burgos and Leon, both of those cathedrals are amazing. And for me, just seeing all the art, in all of the cathedrals, I don't think there was anything surprising. One of the things that I found really interesting is there were, from a historical standpoint, where there were so many places where they had been fixing up the trail, where they had done excavations, where they had found bodies from the Franco regime. Mm. And so Franco assassinated so many people. And so there were a number of memorials to the people who were, disappeared basically during that time. And I didn't know that I would see those. And they were very affecting, and brought me to a place of remembrance and sadness of sort of the atrocities that happen everywhere, but that specifically happened in Spain.
Mm-hmm. What about the physical challenges? You mentioned the blisters that many people had and that you had a few of. Were there other particular physical challenges of doing this hike? Is it really just the overall distance? I mean, you mentioned how your knees had some trouble after a while.
I think one of the big differences for me is walking on pavement and cobblestones. And especially in the Portuguese route, I mean, the first few days it was all either boardwalk or cobblestone. I was like, I'm not going to make this. And then it got a little bit better and there was more dirt, but we'd look every day and it would say 20% turf. And, and sometimes you're walking along a freeway. Right. And so that was really hard on my body because I typically walk on dirt. I live in Tahoe. I walk every single day out my front door, and I can join the PCT. I've walked to Yosemite from my front door. I can walk to Mexico or Canada on dirt. And so for me, that was the biggest challenge, is walking on those hard surfaces.
What about the Camino Portugués? How was that, at least the part that you hiked from Porto to Santiago de Compostela, how was that different from the other Camino, from the Camino Francés?
Well, as I mentioned, we hiked the coastal route.
Oh, that's right. There's an inland route and there's a coastal route. Isn't that right?
Yeah.
Okay.
And so I imagine, I don't know, that the inland route is more like the Frances. I think more people do it, and there's more religious stops and things like that. Where we went, it was mostly all along the coast. It was extremely beautiful. And what I loved about it is we would walk all day, and then we would go to the beach and we would swim. So we'd always have our swimsuits and our backpacks. We'd swim and and then we'd lay on the beach, and then we would walk the little, whatever we had left to do to our place. So it was so amazing to jump in the ocean every day. And so I really love that. But there were not as many people. We didn't meet anyone. We didn't make any friends. So, and we weren't, it wasn't as long, So I think you have to kind of see people a number of times before you make that connection. You see them in a cafe, and then you're in the same albergue, and then you see them on the trail. And then finally you're like, hi, I've been seeing you. We're kind of on the same schedule. So I think it takes a number of days to meet people. So we didn't really meet anybody lasting that we had their contact info or anything like that.
Okay. So just so people who are listening know, from Lisbon to Santiago de Compostela, it's 610 kilometers. And from Porto, it's 290.
Right.
So that's about, 170 miles maybe?
Right.
Am I doing the math right?
Yeah, you can do it. I think we were walking for 10 days or something like that. It's pretty short.
Okay.
Compared to the Frances. Yeah.
So it sounds like the coastal route on the Portuguese is probably similar to the Norte route as far as what you're seeing, that goes along the coast by Bilbao.
Hmm.
You think so? If you wanted a more coastal route from France, you could take that. Is the Norte route the one that goes through Bilbao along the Atlantic coast there?
It goes through San Sebastian,
That's
and
right. Yeah.
yeah, and I think you do have more sort of cities and things like that on that route, and of course it's longer. I mean, people who walked it really loved it. You eventually meet everything eventually kind of falls into the Frances and comes in, except for obviously the Portuguese and the Ingles, which comes from the north because it's the boat route, right, from England. And so I think I don't see myself walking another Camino, but I didn't see myself walking another Camino right after a Camino either. So who knows? But I think if I were to do another Camino in Spain, I would either do from the south, like from Sevilla, there's a route like the Roman route. And there's also a Roman road, which we did get lost together at one point, and we ended up on the Roman road, and there was no one there, and it was absolutely beautiful. And so there are other options. They just don't have the infrastructure. But the Norte, I think, would be a beautiful section to do for sure.
My family was in Bilbao. We have friends that lived there, and we were there in, I think, 2014, and we saw people walking that route. There weren't nearly as many as we saw when we were along the main Camino, the Frances, but we did see people walking it, so that piqued my interest as well. Our host family, our friends there, thought that all these people who were hiking the entire Camino were crazy, by the way. People talk about the Camino a lot. It's one of the most famous collection of hikes in the world. Why is it worth doing? Why is it something that you think other people might want to do or should do? And particularly if it's not a religious calling. I understand why somebody might do it if it's a pilgrimage, and that I completely understand. But for someone where it's not a religious calling, why do you think the Camino de Santiago is worth doing?
I think there's a million reasons. I think some people do it because they want to meet other people. I think we saw a lot of single women doing it, and, they felt safe doing that. And they were really challenging themselves as a way to sort of see what they were capable of. I'm a little bit skeptical of these experiences that are meant to be transformative. And part of it is because I think, in my opinion, we should be making small changes all the time in order to transform our lives, rather than expecting to go on a big walk and having our lives become something different. And so I think some people are disappointed because nothing changes in their lives, and they expected it to. For me, I really think that walking that pace is a really wonderful way to see a place. And so my husband and I tried really hard to go to places that were not we didn't go have pilgrim meals. Like when we went to cities, we went to Michelin star restaurants, that we would want to visit anyway. Or small hole in the wall places that we'd heard about that none of the other, pilgrims knew about or had learned about, because I wanted to also experience Spain. And I think that pace is really good. There are so many people who bicycle the Camino, and particularly now they're on the electric bikes, and they're going so quickly that they're not going to get the same experience as walking, because you're so slow and you really slow down. And I think that's the benefit is seeing it at that pace.
Is there a particular moment or memory for you that stands out? 20 years from now, what will you remember about your hike on the Camino?
So a lot of people set an intention for the Camino. And so before I went, I thought, I'm going to not feel as much grief over my mother's death. My mom died 6 years ago, and I'm still carrying a really heavy burden of grief. And so I thought, okay, I'm going to go, and I'm going to work on that. And I brought this little piece of beach glass that she and I found when I was a little girl. We used to go beachcombing, and I thought I'm going to throw that on this. There's this pile of rocks, which, people throw so many rocks that they have to keep clearing the rocks, and I don't know where they put them. So people bring these really special rocks, and then they won't be there after another couple of months. But anyway, people do this, right? And this is a place that it also has pagan significance, which I liked. And I got there and it was crawling with people because they had just let out like a bunch of tour buses. Because all of these places in the Camino, there are tours where bus tours come. So you've just walked like 400 miles or whatever, then someone comes up in a bus, but that's the way it is. And I thought, well, I'm not leaving my rock there. And so I just kept going to different places where I thought I'm going to leave my rock. And I never felt like there was anywhere I really wanted to throw it. And so I was hiking up, there's a town called Ocebrio or Ocebrero. I'm still not sure how to pronounce it. It's a Galician word. And it's a really beautiful village at the top of this mountain. It's really the only mountain you climb on the Frances, which I loved because, of course, I love to climb mountains. And as I was climbing that, though, I realized it's not about the rock and it's not about some magical grief is going to be burden. It's just a matter of making the best of it and doing the best we can. And so I had a moment there when I cried, and I was exhausted. That probably was why. But for me, that was a moment where I really realized that it doesn't work that way. There wasn't going to be a moment of transformation. There wasn't going to be this letting go of grief and this magical moment. There just wasn't. And that's okay. And I think for me, that was my moment.
That's neat to hear. It strikes a chord with me for something that I've thought about, where we try to pick a moment, but we don't really get to choose the moments, right? The moments choose us in a way. And so it sounds like you were hoping to sort of choose when that moment was in some way, but then the moment happened, maybe despite all your efforts to make it happen, it happens when you least expect it or something like that.
Yeah. And the key to the moment was that there is no moment. That was it for me. It's like, oh,
right. But you did have that realization.
I did. It was different than I expected.
Yeah, no, that's cool. That's interesting to hear. And it sounds like you got a lot out of it, despite that it was different than you expected. All right. Well, Suzanne Roberts, thank you for telling me about your hike on the Camino de Santiago. Before I let you go, though, I have a few more questions.
Of course.
So what is the best backpacking advice or hiking advice or trekking advice that you've ever gotten, or that you would give to someone else if it's not advice that you got from someone?
I don't think I got any advice, which was probably a problem the way I started. And, in the book I wrote, Almost Somewhere, it's all about what not to do. Right. And one of the big things that I would give advice based on my experience is really choose your backpacking partners carefully, especially if you're going on a long walk, because they might be different than you thought, and it might make things a lot harder for you. So if you choose someone who's going to, go off ahead and leave you in your terrible directions, or someone who's not as careful or cautious and wants to go over a pass in lightning, those are big problems. So I guess my biggest piece of advice would be to choose your hiking partners carefully.
That is actually really, really good advice. And I've asked this question to so many people on the show, and I've never heard that answer before. And I think it's a great answer, because I've been on long hikes where it didn't work out, where you had someone who was either hiking a very different kind of pace or a different kind of hike, or like you said, maybe had different considerations about how to deal with tough situations. And it can make an absolutely huge difference in whether you're enjoying the hike, and at the worst case, your own safety. And so that's really good advice. And I think part of what happens is we so casually say, hey, you want to go backpacking to somebody? And then you get 3 days into a 7-day hike and you realize this is going to be rough.
Yeah. And, I think it can happen even on a 1-day trip. I'm a backcountry skier, and I am really careful about who I will go backcountry skiing with. I don't want to go with someone who, if I feel like the terrain, it's a sketchy for avalanches or whatever, or it's too late in the day and we're seeing roller balls and they're saying, no, I have to get to the top. I don't want to go with that person. So I think depending on the level of danger, you might even want to be really careful on a day trip.
That's good advice as well. So that brings me to a question that I think is a perfect follow-up to that is, what is the dumbest thing you've ever done in the backcountry?
I think, it's a really interesting thing, because of course, as soon as you asked that, my first thought was the dumbest thing someone I was with did. but I was with this person when I did the dumbest thing. So I was in my 20s, and I had this boyfriend, and he was super fit, and he was one of those let's go to the top in a lightning storm. And He did a really, really stupid thing where we hiked up Dick's Peak, which is, I'm like pointing out my window because it's in Desolation Wilderness, which I can see from my window. And I can't see Dick's Peak, but I can see Desolation Wilderness. But anyway, he, rather than very carefully go down the snowfield, he put on his rain gear so he could slide down the snowfield. And you know what happened next, right? So he could not stop himself. He didn't have an ice axe. He didn't have any protection. And he really injured himself quite significantly. And we had to carry all his stuff out, and he barely made it out. And so that was a dumb thing that he did. But when I was with this person, and this was actually before this super slide on Dick's Peak, we were hiking Mount Massive in Colorado. And I lived in Vail, so I didn't think I could get altitude sickness. But there's a big difference between living at like 8,000 feet and hiking up to a 14er. And I hadn't taken care of myself. I went out drinking the night before. I didn't eat breakfast. I went at a pace way faster, and I got altitude sickness. And I kept going, and I did finally realize what was happening. And I thought, I gotta get down. I just turned around and went down. But it took me a while. And that could have been really, really life-threatening if I hadn't turned around. But I did turn around. But I went too long.
Even when you knew that you were feeling the altitude sickness, you kept going for a while.
Yeah. And that goes back to choosing your hiking partners and your lovers carefully.
Yeah. All right. What is one hiking adventure besides the Camino de Santiago and besides the John Muir Trail, both of which we've talked about, that others shouldn't miss out on that you've done?
Well, I really loved, I've hiked this twice, both directions. I loved hiking from Yosemite to Tahoe and Tahoe to Yosemite. I think that's really beautiful, and it's not used as frequently. So depending on time of year, you might see a bunch of PCT hikers. If you can either do a route or you can be on the PCT. I think that's really beautiful. And I also really loved, if you're looking for an international walk, I really, really loved the West Highland Way in Scotland.
Yeah.
And I think too, if you like coastal routes, the Lost Coast Trail in Northern California is stunningly beautiful as well. And it's an easier walk than if there's a similar walk up in Washington on the Olympic National Seashore, which is also beautiful, but scary. Like you have to hike through tide pools and super slippery and go up and over rope, which might not be for everyone.
Those are all good suggestions. I've had other guests suggest the Lost Coast. And as I've said before on the show, I've had a permit multiple times and had to cancel. So I keep trying to do that trail and I've still not done it. I'm going to try again, hoping to go next year.
Can I make a recommendation?
Sure, go ahead.
So most people hike it one way and then take a very expensive shuttle, or try to hitchhike, which is like almost impossible because it's like a very long hitchhike. Hike it both ways. So go up and back. That's what we did. And then you don't have to worry about the car shuttle, and you get to see it in a different way. So that's my
perfect. All right. Yeah. I could do that. And then you also mentioned that section of the PCT. I've done that section. I hiked it from, I guess, Carson Pass, so not quite Tahoe, but pretty close. From Carson Pass to Tuolumne. I did that hike once and really enjoyed it. I did it on the PCT, and I know there is that other route, the traditional Tahoe to Yosemite Trail, that's slightly different, or at least sort of partially overlaps. And I also like your suggestion of the West Highland Way. My wife and I hiked that with friends a year ago. So
it's great.
All good suggestions. All right. Last question. What is the next trip on your list?
I don't know. I mean, as far as a backpacking trip or a hiking trip.
Whatever. What's your next outdoor adventure that you're thinking of doing?
Oh, okay. I do have that on the books, actually. But I have been wanting to do a late season backpacking trip. But my husband and I, in a week, are leaving. We have a van. It's not like a fancy van. It's like a down by the river van. And it's green. Its name is Shrek. And we're going to take Shrek to Moab, Utah, for a mountain biking trip. And I'm teaching a travel writing class at the Moab Library. And then we're going to do a bunch of hiking down in like Bears Ears and Escalante. And I want to go down to the Valley of Fire. I've never been there, near Las Vegas. So we were talking about doing a backpacking trip, but we're going to have our mountain bikes. And so we don't want to leave them with the van, but we feel comfortable on day hikes and sleeping in the van. So we're having a van trip, and that's going to happen next week. Yeah, so that's my next adventure.
That sounds like a lot of fun. And it's cool that you have a green van named Shrek.
1999 Ford. Yeah.
Perfect. All right. Well, Suzanne Roberts, thank you for coming on the show. I appreciate it.
Well, thank you. It was great talking to you.
Thanks again to Suzanne Roberts for coming on the show. And I hope we've inspired you to walk the Camino de Santiago. And if you've enjoyed this episode, tell a friend about it, or better yet, give us a good review on whichever podcast service you use. And keep in mind that this podcast is entertainment and meant to spark your interest. If you decide to hike the trail, do your own research. Like anything else worth doing, outdoor adventure has risk. So when you go, pack your common sense. And when you get back, tell me how it went. Let's talk about our next episode. Next time on Trails Worth Hiking, we go back to the Blue Ridge Mountains of the eastern United States for a several-day hike through a national forest that was once Cherokee land. We'll cross a beautiful but steep and rocky terrain, traversing ridges and peaks on this challenging yet rewarding trail. Next time on Trails Worth Hiking, we travel the Art Loeb Trail in the Pisgah National Forest in western North Carolina. If you have any questions or feedback on this episode or ideas for future episodes, including if you want to be a guest and talk about a trail that you've hiked, reach out to me at trailsworthhiking@gmail.com. And again, don't forget to follow us on Instagram at trailsworthhiking podcast. So start planning your next hike, and before you know it, you'll be on the trail. Thanks for listening.